cloud. All right, so we've got a file to download for today. So head on over to the blog and download the file for today. And I think I've already got that open here, called productlist.xlsm. And I think these are just products that I scraped off of the internet, some like outdoor website, like in the early 2000s or something. It's data I've had around for a while. So, you could come in here and what could we buy? The gunsmithing, you could buy the borolite, whatever that is, for $12.99. And what is it anyway? Borolite uses a crystal clear lucite rod to conduct the light to continuous push or push button operation. I don't even know what the borolite is, probably for inspecting the bore on your rifle, I guess. Anyway, so here's all these products. So what we're then focusing on today is debugging and error handling. So let's go ahead and talk about like doing some error handling first, and we'll be doing some debugging tools along the way. So ultimately what I'd like to do is I would like to have a sheet on here called lists. We're going to end up using this same data for when we start working with user forms. So that's a topic that's coming up. So instead of having your user enter data right into a worksheet, you could put up like a form on the screen that says, enter the product name here, or the price, or the manufacturer here. And that way you have a little more control over what folks are entering. Now you can do things like data validation right on the worksheet, but you can do similar things on the form as well. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to be able to have like an independent list of what all the departments are here. There's only like 4 departments: hunting, outdoor, general, apparel. I think that's what the departments are. And so I'd like to be able to have just a list of what those are. And that would be useful whether I'm putting data validation on here or using that as the basis for a drop-down list on the form. I'd like to be able to have that. In fact, there may be several things. Maybe I'd like to have what are the set of my manufacturers. Those are the two. What are the set of categories that I have here? And all I've got here is like the raw product level data. So I'd like to say, I want to be able to see what are the different values in manufacturer, what are the different values for department. And so ultimately what I'd like to do is I would like to get a sheet here called lists. And we'll use that sheet to kind of keep track of these various lists. I would normally have a list for category, a list for department, and a list for manufacturer. So let's go ahead and make some code for this. So I'll open up my code editor. Oh, it looks like I've already got a module in here with an error to start with. Process products, do until products, do until you, and it's just a typo here. Because this isn't bad. Let's go ahead and fix the typo here, until. I've got a loop here, debug.print. So it looks like we're running through everything that we have in column 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's going to print off the names of all of the products. And just go ahead and run that now that I've corrected the typo there. And it's just run through those 860 or so different products, and it's displaying the name of the product as well as the product ID. So column A, and then column, what is that? F, column F. Well, again, and this is some stuff that we've done a few times. Make a loop that goes through and iterates as long as there's data and so forth. So, but let's go ahead and add then another sub procedure in here that's just called add list, sub add list. And I'm going to give it, let's do this. I'm going to call it add to list. And so I'm going to pass it in a list that I want to add to as a string, and a value to add to the list. And so the idea here is I want to be able to say I'm making now a list of categories, or I'm making a list of departments. And if the list doesn't exist, on my sheet, I want to add that list onto the sheet, and then I want to add the value onto that list if it's not already there. So that's the idea here. Now, this is a sub procedure, not a function, and so I'm not going to say, a return value, because that's the difference between a function procedure and a sub procedure. They're exactly the same in every respect, except that when a function procedure is done running, it sends a value back to wherever it was called from. And so since this is not sending a value back, I do not need to put a data type for the sub procedure itself. But I want to start off by just kind of checking to see if I already have a sheet to hold my lists. And if I do, I just want to use it. If I don't, I want to create it. So let's you go ahead and declare a worksheet variable. So I'll just call it S as a worksheet. So how am I going to tell if I already have a worksheet called lists? I mean, as a human, I can just kind of look at the list. I can just look at it and see, is it there? But how am I going to get VBA to know if there already is a worksheet called lists? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I could write a list, write a loop that just goes through across, all the worksheets. How many worksheets could I have in the workbook? I think it's capped at like 255. So even if there's like a couple hundred of them, it's going to take a couple of milliseconds to go through, and that will be pretty efficient. There's a question here.
If exists Boolean operator and then look for the object of the worksheet.
Really? I didn't know you could do that. That's great. If exists, I'm not even sure I was familiar with if exists. So let me just print, let's just try that. If EXISTS, and then what? Reference to the sheet, worksheets.
Yeah, you might have to do this worksheet.
That worksheets will be the default, the active workbook. So that should be okay. It's the only workbook I have open. So that should be okay. And then, this is awesome. And let's put promos there. Subber function not defined, EXISTS. So,
I'm thinking of Python.
Oh yeah, I was kind of surprised. This would have been exciting to me because that would have been great if that would have worked. And I'm not 100% positive that there is no way to do this directly, but I've looked and haven't found it. So I think the idea of kind of looping through all the ones and seeing do we find a match is kind of the way that we would normally do that in VBA. And again, for this, it wouldn't be that bad because that will happen pretty quickly. But it turns out there's some things that kind of take a long time for you to figure out, is it going to fail or not? None of them are coming to mind right now. And it's not all that common. But because I want to teach you what an error trap is, I'm going to show you a different way to do it. So instead of just looking to see if that sheet exists, and then I could figure out does it exist or not, I'm just going to try to bind my variable onto that sheet. So I'm going to set my variable equal to worksheets. In fact, I may say this workbook.worksheets. By the way, if I don't say this workbook, then what workbook is it going to assume it's looking at? Whichever one happens to be active. And so if I know I really am talking about the workbook that is holding this code, it's always a good idea to say, yeah, I'm talking about the workbook that has this code, so to use this workbook. And then I'm looking for one called lists, L-I-S-T-S. Now, this will only succeed if this object actually finds a worksheet. And so I'm going to go ahead and run this, and I'm expecting this to give me an error. Whoops. Now I can't just run this directly because it's saying, listen, if you're going to run this, what do I have to do? I've got to give it a list and a value that I'm trying to put a value to the list on. So let me just do a little debugging thing here. I'm going to make another sub procedure. I'm going to call it my Acme sub runner, ACME sub runner. Imagine Wile E. Coyote has ordered this, from some online service, the Acme Corporation. I'm calling it Acme because I want it to be alphabetically first out of all my procedures. And I'm just going to have this call my function I'm working on. And let's say I'm going to add hunting to a list called department. DPART. So this way, if I'm down here working on my add to list and I go to run it and I hit F5, it's going to say, oh, you can't run this one because you've got to give me both a list and a value that you want to add this information onto. And so it says you can't possibly want to run this one. So it gives me the list of the ones that it can run. And because this one I've named to be alphabetically first, then it's the one that is already highlighted. So if I just hit F5 and then hit enter, it will execute that procedure. And in this case, it's going to give me an error. I'm guessing you've seen this before. I'm going to hit debug on this. It says runtime error number 9, subscript out of range. I hit debug. I get the yellow line that says I got this far in your code and I couldn't execute this line. Runtime error. Now, let's talk about the 3 different kinds of errors before we see how to handle this particular one. Kind of the most severe kind of error you can have is a syntax error. When you write a syntax error, what you've written is so bad that the interpreter looks at it and it says, I have no idea what you're talking about. In fact, we can make this into a syntax error just by spelling workbook, this workbook. And I'll run this. And when I try to run this, it doesn't even actually run this. Variable not defined. And it says, I don't know what you're talking about here. Variable not defined. The interpreter looks at that and it goes, yeah, I can't even compile. I can't even start to run this. What you've done is so bad. So I'll say, okay, or, another one would be, if I've, left a keyword off of like dim, so that's spelled incorrectly. And all I get here is syntax error. So it says, no idea what you're talking about here. Now, the nice thing about the syntax error is you're going to get some clue about where the error happens, because the interpreter or the editor here is going to show you the line that it can't process. And so syntax errors, you just have to get rid of them, right? You've got to write something that the interpreter can understand and translate into machine language to be able to give it to the processor of your computer to go and do something. So that's a syntax error. Now, kind of the second kind of error is a runtime error, which we're addressing here. Go ahead and get rid of these syntax errors. But before we kind of dive in and address this one, let me talk about the third kind of error, and that's a logic error. Logic error is an error that, as far as VBA is concerned, is no error at all. You told it to do something. It does exactly what you told it to do. But what you told it to do isn't what you thought you told it to do, and it doesn't do what you expect it to do. So the logic errors are tough to track down because VBA doesn't help you find out where they are, right? It doesn't ever say, here's the problem. So logic errors, like syntax errors, you just got to get rid of them. They can be particularly dangerous because depending on what the conditions are for the code running, that logic error might not show up for a long time after you write the program. Like the conditions that get into that part of the code just may never be met for a while. So they can be, those are the ones that kind of make it into production. Hopefully not often. But kind of in between those two extremes is a runtime error. The runtime error says, hey, syntactically what you've done looks great. The interpreter can look at what you've done, it can parse it, it can say, yeah, I understand what you're telling me to do. But at the point that it tries to do it, it's unable to do it because what you told it to do isn't valid. And that is, it's not a problem that's so bad it can't figure out what you're trying to say. It can figure out what you're trying to say, but when it tries to do it, it fails. And if we look at this line here, syntactically, this is beautiful. I've got an object variable. Yeah, S is a variable. It's a worksheet. That's right. Set, that's how I bind an object variable onto an object. So I set, I got a valid object variable, got the equal sign. We go, this workbook, it knows exactly what this workbook means. It's identifier for a particular workbook. It's the one that happens to have the code in it. And then it says worksheets. Yeah, great. It's a collection on that workbook. What's it's expecting when you call the worksheets method? It's expecting a string argument in there, and it goes, yeah, perfectly. The parentheses are there, the quotes are there. This looks great. What's the problem? Yeah, when it tries to identify a worksheet with that name, there isn't one. And so this does not identify a valid, this then does not identify a valid object, and so I can't bind that onto the object variable. The syntax is perfect, but when it tries to accomplish it, it's unable to accomplish it. You see the distinction between these two. Kind of show me on 0 to 5 where you are with this. 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. Okay. So with both the syntax error and the logic error, you've just got to get rid of them. Runtime errors, you don't necessarily need to get rid of, but you do need to either get rid of them or trap them. And I'm going to show you how to trap this error. So remember, the idea here is I want to behave differently based on whether that sheet exists or not. One approach would be figure out if the sheet exists. Another approach is just try to do what you want to do. And if it fails, notice that it failed, see why it failed, and then behave, give it something else to do based on that failure. And that's what we're going to do right here. Okay, so the normal behavior for VBA when you get a runtime error is to stop the code and put up a message right here in the editor environment to say, this is what the problem is. So what I want to do is I want to tell it, listen, don't do the default behavior. I'm going to give you some different behavior. So when there's an error, I want you to behave differently than normal. So, and the way I say that is, hey, the way I say, if there's an error, do something different, I'm going to say on error. And what I'm going to say here is on error, resume next, R-E-S-U-M-E next. What on error resume next says, it says, if there's a runtime error, ignore that error and move on. If I just put this line at the top of any procedure, I have immediately converted any runtime error into a logic error. Because now the code's just gonna run. It's never gonna show me the problem. It's gonna continue executing. It'll execute anything that it can execute, and it'll be done. As far as the interpreter is concerned, no problem. So I'm going to be very judicious about the way that I use on error resume next. And I'm going to just kind of use it right close to the code that I think might throw an error that I want to behave differently for. And so now I'm going to go ahead and run this, and you'll see it won't do anything, no error. It'll have no error, and it won't actually do anything because it doesn't show the error message, because this suppresses that error message. And it says, just try to execute the stuff. And if it fails, it must not have been that important. Skip it and move on. So you never want to just put this in code by itself and say you're done. So now what we want to do is we want to come in here and we want to check to see if a particular kind of error happened. So I'm going to put a breakpoint here, stop, and I'll run this code again. Okay, so now I've gotten past this line. This line failed, but it failed silently because I said, hey, if there's an error, just keep on going. So now I'm going to say, I want to check and see what error happened. Well, fortunately, there's an object called ERR, and it has a property called number. And that's going to tell me this was error number 9. So error number 9 happened. By the way, let me put a breakpoint before the line that causes the error and run the code to here. I'm going to ask it what the error number is right now, and it's going to tell me 0. Error number of 0 means there's no error. There was no error. As soon as I execute this next line, which I can do just by coming to my debug menu and doing step into, and that's F8, by the way, my keyboard F8 will do that. So now that just triggered that error. So now if I ask for the error number again, it'll tell me error number 9 is the active most recent error. So with this on error resume next in place, I can now put an if statement and check to see what error has happened. If err.number, by the way, there's also an error description. So if you want, your code can look at the description as well. And I need to comment that out so I can run this. And so you get kind of the two things that show up in that dialog box, error number 9 and the description that goes with that error, subscript out of range. So now I'm expecting this might be an error number 9. So if error number equals 9, then I want to do something. And then I want, at this point, I'm done, right? This is where I was expecting. Here's where I was expecting the error to be. Now I've written code to see, did that error happen? If so, let's do something with it. And so I'm going to want to tell the Visual Basic interpreter to go back to normal error handling. I definitely don't want to have lots of other code running while this is active, because if there's another runtime error, we'll get no indication that there was an error. It'll just keep going. So I'm going to tell it to go back and put it in a comment first. Return to normal error handling. And the way that I tell it to return to normal error handling is really weird. I'll start off, it'll seem reasonable the way we start off, on error. Now, to understand the next thing that I'm going to write, we have to set the Wayback Machine to the very early days of BASIC. Not the early days of Visual Basic, the early days of BASIC. So we're now like in the early 1980s. Back then, when you're writing a program in the language BASIC, you had to number each one of your lines. Like the line number was part of the code that you were writing. So you'd say, this is line number 10, and you would tell it to do something. Next line is line number 11. You would tell it to do something. Next line is line number 12. You could skip line numbers. So you can say, this is line number 10, this is line 20, this is line 30. And the way that you would branch from one part of the code to another is you would say, oh, you know, at this point, I would like to just jump from here based on this if statement to a different part of the program. And you might say, I want to go to line 500 at this point. And you would actually say, go to 500. And it would just get that statement, go to 500. It would jump down to line number 500 and continue executing the code there. It made for really, really ugly code and difficult to maintain. But the very first legal line number was line number 1. And so if you gave it a direction that said, go to a line number that doesn't exist, that's a problem. And what I'm saying here is on error, hey, if there's an error, I want you to go to 0. I'm telling it, hey, if there's an error, go somewhere that is totally impossible to go to. And because it can't do that, it reverts back to its normal error handling, which is to show the dialog box. I mean, it's a really weird way to say it, but that's the way that you turn the default error handler back on. So now if I do something after this that throws a runtime error, it will do this normal thing, stop the code, highlight the line in yellow, put a dialog box up that says what the error is. But between these two statements, the on error resume next and the on error go to 0, if there's an error that happens in here, it's just going to keep on moving. Now I'm anticipating that it'll be error number 9. And so I want to make my code that deals with that. I want it to deal with it right here. So what am I going to say? What do I want it to do if it's error number 9? I want to create a new worksheet. I want to call it lists. I want to bind the S variable onto it. So I'll set S equal to worksheets.add, S.name equals lists. And so now by the time I get to here, what I'm expecting is that now there is a sheet called lists, either because it existed already, or when I tried to connect onto it, oh, a sheet called list and S is bound to it. Either this line succeeded when I tried to bind S onto it, meaning the sheet already exists, or if there was an error, if it was error number 9 at least, then I made a new sheet, bound it onto S, and then changed the name to lists. Make sure that's a string and capitalized correctly. And then I'm done trapping that error. So on error, go to 0. And then I'm ready to go. So now when I run this, in fact, we'll go ahead and step through this. I've been putting breakpoints in the code by writing the keyword stop. I can also put a breakpoint by clicking over here in the gray margin. And that's probably happened to you at some point earlier in the course without realizing what it is. You clicked there, it turned a red line. You went, oh my heavens, what have I done? You clicked on it, it went away, and you went, whew. I don't know what that was, but I'm really glad it's gone. Right? That's just a breakpoint. That's not written in the code, but just here in the environment. So now if I run this, it'll stop when it gets to this line. And now I can just use F8 to step one line at a time. Now, if that did have an error, then this condition will be true and I'll come into here. It did. So now it's creating that worksheet. It's changing the name. You'll see it change the name over here. And then just using F8, I'm going through one line at a time to see exactly how it executes. So setting a breakpoint and then stepping through your code is really powerful because you can see actually which part of your code it's actually going into. Questions? Yes.
I get error 91.
Error number 91, what's the message that goes with it?
Option variable for width block.
Okay, so if you're getting object variable or width block variable not set, let's make sure you've got the dim statement is good. And you're setting s equal to lists. So yeah, interesting. We're gonna have to take a look. We'll take a look at it after class and see if we can find out why it's giving you 91. Anyone else getting a 91 there instead of a 9? Okay. The one other thing that we probably should do to make this a little more complete is there could be other reasons why this code fails besides 9. And so let's just kind of check that. Now, I cannot think of any, well, could be, apparently it could be error number 91. So let's suppose you're kind of working on the homework where it's asking you to delete a worksheet. And if that fails, just kind of move on silently. Then what we've covered here is going to help you with that. But if you're deleting a worksheet, there's kind of 2 reasons that deleting a worksheet could fail. One of them is exactly the same reason here, right? If I try to refer to that worksheet and then delete it, if that worksheet doesn't exist, then that's going to have the same error number 9 that's here. But what's another reason that the code could fail when trying to delete a worksheet? If the worksheet did exist, why might it fail? Yeah, if it's the very last worksheet, you're not allowed to delete all the worksheets. And so that would be a different reason that it's failing. And so it's always healthy to say, I'm expecting error number 9. And if it's error number 9, I know exactly what's going on. I'll work with it. But otherwise, we should probably check for something else. So I'll say else if err.number is different than 0, then we know this was some other error. And then we could then do something different if there's another error, including send ourselves an email to say, hey, this program, had if this is, code that we've got someone else running, it might be nice. We could have code that actually sends information to a Google form that says, hey, you had this error, this runtime error just happened in your code. And then, hopefully fail gracefully, or at least we could tell it to just to continue again. I'm trying to remember. I don't often just tell it to kind of show the error that it would otherwise show. Let me see if I can remember how to do it. I think it's raise, err.raise. And then, yeah, just the number. So I'm going to go ahead and have it raise error number 9. Yeah, and so that does what, exactly what the default error handler would do. So I could come in here and say err.raise err.number. And then after that happens, oh yeah, that'll just make it handle like normal. So what I'm saying here is that, listen, try to do this. If it fails with error number 9, I'm anticipating that. I know what that is. Here's how I want to behave. If it's any other error, just show that error as it normally would. And then once we get past that, we're ready to move on. So if there's either no error or it's error number 9, we'll flow through. Otherwise, we'll show the error as we normally would. Questions? This is called an error trap. And it is a normal thing to do. This is not like something that I would write in my code just to help with debugging. Like this is the kind of code that I might leave in production. Now, for this particular example, I think we're probably better looping through the worksheets to see if the worksheet exists and then behaving differently. But this will work. This will work just fine. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and actually have this worksheet do something. So I think here's the idea. What I want to do is I just want to create a list of values. Maybe in row number 1, we'll have the name of the list, and then going down from that would be the values that we want to put into the list. And so now at this point, I know I've got a sheet, and I know I've got the list sheet, and we are attached onto it with S. So I'll go ahead and declare another variable here. I'm going to call it found cell as a range, set found cell equal to, I just want to look in row 1 of this sheet to see if my list is already here somewhere. So I'm going to set that equal to my worksheet dot rows number 1. Look at my first row, and I'm going to call the find method. That find method looks for something. I want to look for the list. And I want to match the whole contents of the cell. So I'm going to skip the next couple of arguments. So comma, 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 XL whole. That will do a match on the whole text of the cell. So this now will either be, so at this point, found cell will either be bound onto the cell that it found the value, or this is going to be a, it'll be nothing. It won't be bound onto anything. And so let me just go ahead and use that to check. I will say if found cell is nothing, then that means we didn't find it, else we did find it. Found the list. Oops. Okay, so we probably should be keeping track of the column that we found that in. So let me dim column as an integer. All right, so if we found the list, then we're going to make column equal to the column that we found it in. So column equals found cell.column. So now if it says, what are we looking for here first? Department. So if it finds department in row 1, then we're going to know the column that has our department list in it. If we didn't find it, then we want to add a new list here. So let's do this. Column equals, and I just want to add this to the right of whatever existing lists I might have on this sheet. And so let me do this. S.cells, row number 1, And I want to start at the very far right here. I want to come all the way out here to the end, the very last column, and then just do like a control left arrow until it bumps into something. That's where it'll find data. And I want to put it, somewhere after that. So I'm going to start, I'm going to refer to a specific cell. What cell is it? It's row number 1, column number, however many columns there are. Well, my worksheet S has a property called columns, and it has a count. And so if there are 16,000 columns, that will be that'll be the cell that's in row number 1, column number 16,000. From there, I want to do an end XL to left. So that's like hitting control left arrow. And I want to ask for the column that it found. Now, that will be the column that actually has the data. And so I either want to add 1 onto that, so it's the next column to the right, or I want to add 2 onto that, which will give me a blank column in between the data, that last existing data, and the new data that I'm putting in. In which case now I'm ready to put a value there. S dot cells, row number 1, column number column, dot value is equal to whatever list I was trying to find. So remember, I'm passing in a list like, oh, I think I have these backwards. The list that I'm looking for is department, and the value I'm trying to put on it is hunting. So I'm looking for the department list. If I didn't find it, list, dot value. And so if I find the list in that first row, great. I'm going to just know the column that I found it in. Otherwise, I'm going to figure out where to put that list, figure out the column to put that, and then write the list name into that column. Either way, when I get here, I know the column that has the list. Oh, so now the question that I want to answer is the value that I'm trying to add to the list already in the column? Well, that's going to be really similar to finding if the column existed. And so I'm just going to say if, and here we can do this all with one and a fell swoop. Because if it's already there, I don't want to do anything else. If it's not there, I want to add it to that column. So if s dot columns, and I want to look in the column that is marked by my column. So if I'm looking in column number 5, I'm now going to be looking, I want to find in column number 5. Dot find. In this case, I'm looking for value. And again, I want to do a whole cell contents match. So XL whole. And if it doesn't find it, so if not, let's see. No, that's right. If that thing is nothing. Oh, let's see. Let me just check really quick and see what this returns. Another interesting thing in debugging, if you're not quite sure, like the data type of a variable or what's actually getting returned, you can ask for the type name of anything. So type name of a string constant, that'll tell you it's a string. If I put in numeric constant here, it'll tell us that it's integer, that's fine. but I can ask for the type of this. So active sheet. Looking in column 1, I'm trying to find something that doesn't get found. Yeah, so that returns nothing. So that doesn't find it. So if that is nothing, then that means that the value is not in the list. So I'm just ready to add it. So I'll do something similar to when I added my new column. I'm just going to say s.cells. Which row? I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to start at the very bottom and come up till I find data. So s.cells row number, s.rows.count, column number column. So that'll be the very last cell in that column, COLUMN. From there, I want to do end XL up. From there, I want to offset 1 row, 0 columns. And I want to set the value of that cell equal to the value that got passed in. Ooh. And I think that will do it. So now, if I kind of loop through all of my data, and on each cell, I call add to list and pass in the values that I'm after, the list I want to add it to and the value I'm trying to add it. If it needs to create the sheet, it'll create the sheet. If it needs to add the list onto that list, it'll add the list. If the value doesn't exist on that list, it'll add it to the bottom. So I should get a list of unique values here. So let me just, after I print that out, let me go ahead and call add to list. And the first thing is the list that I'm interested in, department. And the second is the value that has that on it, which is column C. So products, column C. Row, column number C. Whew, can I write that much VBA code and have it work on the first shot? It would take a miracle. Let's find out. I'm going to come back. Here's where I'm calling add to list. I'll go ahead and run that. COLUMN. It's gone through that list. Yeah, and so now it's put on here my list name, and it's got the different unique values from here. So I should be able to kind of also easily put on my manufacturers. So that's just column D. You can do the same thing with my list of manufacturers. And now I've got a unique list of manufacturers here as well. Okay. The key thing that we're noticing here is this error trap. If there's an error, keep on going. It's going to be tightly scoped around the thing that I think might be problematic, and I'm turning it off once I've dealt with it. If when I try to identify the worksheet called list, it fails because that sheet doesn't exist, that'll be error number 9. I'll decide what to do. Otherwise, raise the normal error that it otherwise would have risen, and then move on with my code. Questions here? There are a lot of other variations that I can do with building an error trap, and the book talks about some of those, but I have found this particular technique to be the most beneficial in the VBA code that I've written over the past, good heavens, 25 years, 27 years. Okay, so that's trapping errors. So for runtime errors, logic errors, and syntax errors, you just got to get rid of them. You have another option for runtime errors, and that is you can trap them and then decide how to behave based on the reason for the error. Okay, let me show you a couple other tools for debugging. I'm going to come up here to my outer, to the procedure that runs my outer loop. And I'm going to go ahead and just show you that when you have just a regular sub-procedure that you're executing, in other words, not one that's taking parameters, you could just run this with F5. Instead of running it with F5, you could run it with F8. So by pressing F8, it will actually just start off this running by step by step. Now, when I get here to add to list, if I just press F8, F8 is step into. And what the into means is that step into will actually go into the sub-procedure that you're calling. So I'm calling add to list. If I press F8, it's going to take me step by step through that one as well. And if I get to some point where I realize, okay, I've seen enough in this sub-procedure, I want to step out of this sub-procedure back to where it was called from, well, that's debug step out, which is Control-Shift F8. So when I press Control-Shift F8, it's going to just continue running the rest of the sub-procedure and then stop right back where it was called from. Control-Shift F8 is going to take me right here. So F8 will kind of step me into it. Control-Shift F8 steps me out, but the one that I use most often is step over, which is just Shift F8. Because what that does is it says, listen, I don't want to go, my add to list is working fine. I don't need to see what that's doing. Just go run that whole thing. And it's named a little bit bad, I think, because the name of it is step over. So if I come to debug here, it's called step over, Shift F8. And if I'm on this, kind of getting ready to run this line and I step over it, that seems to think I'm not doing that line. I'm like not doing it, but it still executes that line. It just doesn't step through it. So Shift F8 will go and run all of that whole line, but treat it as just one statement. So when you're kind of stepping through code, those are your three options. Step into, which says, anytime I call a sub-procedure, I want to go see that sub-procedure line by line. Step over says, oh, I'm calling a sub-procedure here. Just run it all as one statement. And then step out says, oh, if I'm in a sub-procedure, I can kind of finish running that sub-procedure and then pause would be Control-Shift F8. The thing to realize too is that anytime you've got this yellow line, you can just tell it to continue running again. Just hit the play button and it'll just keep running from that point. Yeah, and often when you're just starting at this, you think, oh, I've had an error, I've got to stop it and then move again on there. No, you can correct your code and you can even say, oh, you know what? I've changed this. I don't want this to be called manufacturer. I want it to be M-A-N-F, just manif. And now I can take that yellow line, that yellow arrow, and I can drag it back up to that line and tell it to run from there again. So I'll hit play and it will run that out and it will build that, now under a different list name. And so being able to drag your current statement indicator to a different place, really, really powerful. And a lot of debugging environments that work with today are kind of like even active and useful today don't have that feature. So that's a really nice thing about the VBA environment. Okay, questions on stepping through code, stepping into and over code? One more tool I want to show you for debugging. And actually, let me go ahead and step into this again, F8. When I've got the yellow line here, then it means this sub-procedure is loaded into memory. Any variables that are allocated with this are loaded into memory. And now I can take a look and see what they are. So I could come here to my immediate window and just say question mark row. And it tells me, yeah, right now row is 2. If I run this a little while, just lay on F8 for a little while or Shift F8. And then row has changed. If I ask for row again, I can see, now it's 9. So the immediate window is nice because I can just kind of look and see the value of any expression. But another tool that's really handy is to view what's called the locals window. The locals window, and unfortunately, I really can't zoom into this in any way, But this locals window says, oh, here, you've got this variable called row. And right now it's 9. Great. I can watch that change without having to print it out. I can watch that change as I'm running through my code. I know it's tiny, but can you see it there counting 31, 32, 36, 39, 40, 40, and so forth. And so this will just show me the value of all of my variables that I have declared at that point. So I can kind of go line by line, run my code, and see how the variables are changing in memory. And so that will be really helpful then as you're debugging. Okay, I think that's enough. The book talks about some other techniques for debugging, and those, may be kind of handy for more kind of advanced kinds of things, but these tools are going to get you going and serve you well throughout this class. All right, any other questions? Thanks for coming. Class dismissed.